inside of the freight house here at East Broad Top with some memorabilia. Nice lanterns, switch lanterns. Back here is the Orbisonization sign, which has seen better days. Freight house where they unload the box cart on the side here.
To 1874, and the point was to serve a big new iron furnace, the ruins of which are out behind the green car barn. You can see that V in the ridge there, where the Blacklog Creek cut its way through that ridge and exposed a bunch of iron ore. There had been iron furnaces here since the 1780s. Y'all hear? Oh, that guy. How are you, sir?
Mr. B. Miller, all the better for having seen you, sir.
Ah.
I'm the king of schmooze today.
This guy, Gene Tucker, leads our volunteer track crew of retirees who show up during the week to help our regular track crew. And what I will say is apparently it's doing okay for him, because a few weeks ago when we had the Friends of the East Broad Top reunion, this guy's out on the hand car exceeding yard speed limits going uphill by himself, right? So just don't mess with him. Anyway, so I think I gotten as far as saying that there was going to be a big new iron furnace. There'd been iron furnaces here since the 1780s. But this new furnace is going to be 2 stacks. They're going to be way bigger than the earlier ones, and it's going to be a whole different level of technology. For one thing, they were going to use as fuel not charcoal, which the earlier furnaces had used, but coke. Charcoal, as you probably know, is made out of wood. Of course, I'm an English major, so I don't know this kind of stuff until I start volunteering at a railroad. Coke is made from coal. So, big new iron furnace right there, iron ore right there in that V in the mountains, multiple layers of iron mines. Limestone, which you also need. Limestone is the flux. When you heat up the iron ore, limestone attracts the impurities away from the iron. So those are both right there. There's a stone quarry right on the other side of that, the Blacklog Narrows. But to get the coal to make into coke, they needed to go 19 miles south and west. And it's not 19 miles as the crow flies, but in railroad terms, you're going to go south, you're going to go over west through Three Springs and Saltillo. You're going to start climbing some pretty steep grades. You're going to go through one tunnel. Not easy to find. What you can find, and it's pretty much not too badly snake season now, 3 big strings of beehive coke ovens that are super cool, brick domed ovens. They would have put the coal in, sealed it up, and baked it into coke.
Okay.
We are hoping to get to a point where we can do a walking trail with appropriate signs back through there to give people a sense of the dimensions. If you ride the trolley, you'll see a little brick ruin that is the center 1-story of brick of the center 3-story powerhouse that had these 2 enormous stacks behind it and all this other stuff. So
Now the trolley would be great for folks who might not be able to do the walk. Got it.
yep, absolutely. Anybody else? All right. We will head across the tracks here, and you will, of course, remember to look both ways crossing the track in case Nevin is whipping through on the speeder or the Acela is coming by or whatever. Just a little, wait for people to catch up here. This was delivered with a compressed air drive mechanism, but at some point that wore out and the railroad was too cheap to replace it. So they dumped it in the dirt out by the carpenter's shed, and this became an Armstrong turntable. Our new chief mechanical officer says he is committed to, you don't want to drop something down underneath there, because I'm not going in to get it. Our new chief mechanical officer is committed to restoring the compressed air drive mechanism. He makes lots of promises, so we'll see how that goes. If you have a steam locomotive balanced over the center bearing, 2 guys can swing this around fairly easily, or 3 guys. The only challenge being that the steam locomotive is in between the 2 big levers. We're going to come off the other end here. I don't have to pat you down afterwards and make sure there isn't a bell in the pocket or something. So the railroad got a new president in 1903. This is just about the time that they are beginning to evolve from the iron furnace serving railroad to the coal railroad. His name was Siebert. He got money from the board of directors to make a lot of upgrades. So he starts putting in heavier rail. He starts rebuilding all of the bridges. Right at the end of his career, he lived till 1913. The railroad bought its first steel hopper cars from the Press Steel Car Company of Cincinnati. They ended up reverse engineering the hopper car design and building 150 steel hopper cars here at this little out-of-the-way railroad in 5 years. So this railroad is kicking out 30 steel hopper cars a year in addition to everything else it was doing. This is the only American narrow gauge that ever went to an all-steel freight car fleet. We built our own box cars here. The one that you saw over by the freight house was built here, built flat cars. Siebert also started buying new locomotives, of which this was the third from December of 1911. It was the locomotive before this, the one he bought in 1908, that was kind of the game changer. And it's hard to imagine now, but really the sexy game changer item is this wheel set under the cab here. All of our locomotives we have now have this, which is called a trailing truck, and it is supporting the firebox for the locomotive. Earlier locomotives, the firebox had been between the driving wheels, and the driving wheels are only 3 feet apart, right? So that really constrains your fire area. They ended up actually with these keyhole-shaped fireboxes that would come up between the drivers and then expand out. But putting the firebox on its own wheel set gives you the opportunity to build the firebox out, another 6 inches on both sides, and you can be making a lot more heat. This locomotive was the first of this wheel design with a 2-wheel pony truck up front, 8 driving wheels, and the 2-wheel trailing truck. This 282 design, many of you know, is called the Mikado class design because the first 282 locomotives were sold to a railroad in Japan. This locomotive was so popular here that the railroad went back to Baldwin a year later and said, "Can you sell us something bigger?" Baldwin sent number 14, and 2 years after that, number 15, their sister locomotives. The railroad goes back to Baldwin again 2 years after that, so that gets us to 1916, and says, what's the biggest thing that is going to fit around our curves and through those tunnels? And Baldwin sent the first of what ended up being 3 big superheated locomotives, number 16, 17, and 18, the last of which came in 1920. These were the biggest locomotives that had been built for an American narrow gauge up to that point, and until Baldwin built the K36s for the Rio Grande, they remained the biggest. They were, for their day, up to the minute, high-tech, superheated steam, southern valve gear. So this had become a very modern railroad with a steel freight car fleet, new bridges, pretty much everything going on. So back in the day, this would have been not exactly the rival of a mainline Class 1 railroad, but it was definitely keeping up. In busy years, the railroad was running 4, sometimes 6 trains of coal cars a day to the coal washing plant. They had about, call it 10 trains worth of hopper cars that they could use, so they were pretty much running a conveyor of coal trains back and forth. It was a pretty serious operation.
So even with all that investment, they still could make a profit.
Yes. I mean, Lee Rainey, who's the historian of the East Broad Top, has a book that goes into the business ups and downs at great length. So you feel free to enjoy that. I'm an English major, not a business guy. So all I know is they were doing well enough that they stayed in business. Towards the end, they contemplated buying diesels, and they got proposals, I think, on 2 different occasions from diesel manufacturers. But what they concluded was Yeah, the railroad would be cheaper to run with diesels, but honestly, there's not that much coal left. It's gonna make sense to get out, so. Does everybody know exactly how the steam locomotive works, or should I give the very quick description? Or would one of you like to give the very quick description?
Probably have people here who could do that.
That's what I'm just, does anybody either A, not know how the steam locomotive works, or not know and be so completely bored with having been dragged to so many railroads over the years that they don't give a you-know-what? I'm not seeing any hands go up for more explanation of how the steam locomotive works, so maybe we'll pass that up. How about, because I can see there's a lot of interest, we'll just have like 5 minutes to wander around, not going over past the 12 here, but you can wander around from here over to stall 1 and take pictures and look at things. Please do not climb into anything. You think I can trust y'all to do that? The little kids didn't even fall in the pit, so. What is going on over there? They have a new tender, or they've rebuilt the tender truck for the 16. The 16 is over in stall 8, and that will be our first steam locomotive out. They rebuilt the tender frame, rebuilt the trucks for it. Right now they've just repainted the sand domes and the steam dome for the 16, so those are over there. We've had a new tender tank made for the 16, but it is not currently here. It's getting coated inside. The 16 is at the point of putting parts back on it, but I think we are still waiting on the calculations, the boiler calculations, that will tell us what steam pressure will be allowed to operate it at. And they don't want to start putting tubes in until those calculations come back, just in case there's anything they want to tweak.
So it's still, I'm sure money is the biggest factor. There's still a plan to eventually get all these operational again?
Yes, that's right.
Or is that not realistic?
Locomotives have to undergo a 90-day
So-
inspection.
I'm not
Which
making any
involves
promises on behalf of the foundation because that would be foolish.
That's wise, actually.
Well, to make promises would be foolish. There's certainly interest in the foundation in getting all of the locomotives back in business. This poor little puppy has some firebox issues. They've all got running gear issues because they were run hard and put away wet, and locomotives that back in the day would have gone down to the shops for a rebuild every few years ran, 40 years of current service without major running gear work. So there's definitely some money to be spent here, but I wouldn't call it a plan because it's just what board members have discussed, but board members have informally
It's a
discussed
hope.
getting everything back in service.
Can I have the steel diesel?
Yeah. So Lynn Modinger from the Strasburg Railroad, the guy who wrote the boiler regulations the Federal Railroad Administration is using, he's on our board. One of his proteges, Dave Dimitrovich, is now our master mechanic. It is
Oh, yeah, I remember reading that.
it is possible to get really good folks. So this is precision work, but it's not rocket science. It was, very common back in the day. And there are still really good books to tell you how to do
Good old
stabilization.
12.
Until you get to some weirdo
Poor
part that
thing.
got duct taped together here a zillion years ago, and then you have to figure out what
Wooden
they were
cow
trying to
catcher.
do. They did with the 16,
There's the domes.
when they were dropping drivers, the
M4.
boxes that hold the drivers,
They're working on it. 16.
there were some parts that were supposed to come off in like 20 minutes and took a week and a half. Kind of thing. So there are always surprises. Yes, sir.
17. One of the middle bigger engines.
So these are inside
15 last ran in 2011.
outside of the drive, and then the axle comes through on calibrated outside that.
17 last ran in 2001.
I don't know what the thinking was about why we never ran that. Their locomotives are wider. No. The biggest one is 837 standard also.
18, the last of the ones they built. And the M1 with its repaired roof. We got a grant to repair the roof on the M1, which is awesome. 18 is the biggest of the last bigger engines. So pretty much all 6 of their engines look pretty identical.
It sort of goes on.
So 16 is pretty close to getting put back together. Got all the dirt and stuff, and 18's tender. May run again sometime soon, 15.
So we have to put that in. And then we start juggling stuff around. You'll be able to see over in stall number 2 that has the 18 in it now. We've had to slice off a little bit of the smoke jack to get the locomotive in underneath of it. Just no end of surprises. Which was also interesting. There is new fire suppression pipe in here. The engineers who were designing this fire suppression system come in and discovered that the roundhouse bays are not exactly the same. Some of them are 7 degrees from the next, and some of them are 7 and a little smidge here and there. Maybe a little bit crazy. So we will head over towards stall number 1, except possibly for Father Tucker, who is busy explaining some stuff over there. He can do whatever he wants, all the tracking's in it.
I have a weirdly specific question.
Oh, good. It's Stump the English major now, isn't it? Go ahead, fire.
So, why did they put that sheet metal in the cab to turn it into a deckless cab, effectively? So the fireman can't see the engineer, right? They put sheet metal around the firebox door.
Well, so the firebox has to have insulation on it.
Oh, but
And-
this is beyond that. I mean, this extra.
No, the fireman can see the fireman can see the engineer. They're deckless because you want to keep the locomotive as short as possible and have as much boiler as possible. And there are a couple different designs of cabs, like the 12, the back end of the 12 has a little bit more of a wall on it, but
Okay.
they meant to be able to communicate to each other.
Okay. Yeah, because I've never seen something where they've like built their own deckless cab, right?
No, these came from Baldwin Deck.
Oh, but I mean with that sheet metal, right? Around it.
So there's some metal across the back, but there's not metal across the top of the boiler. So they would have been able
No,
to
it's
yell
just around the
across-
fire door and then the back wall.
Yeah, so that back
Yeah.
wall, yes, there is a back wall there, but that's not going to keep the engineer from talking to the fireman. I hope. All right, stall number 1. Please. They do not come out this side intentionally. Interesting story about that. The 16, the locomotive that will be first completed, is said to have been haunted. And ma'am, I really wouldn't walk on that.
Okay,
So the 16 was said to have been haunted. It had been given a pretty serious overhaul in 1955 and then only run a handful of times in early 56 and then put away and never run in the tourist years at all. And what we were told was that Stanley Hall, the longtime general manager, thought it was haunted. It does turn out that it's got a slightly different throttle design than the two other big locomotives, and it did apparently have a tendency to have throttle leaks. So you would put these locomotives away hot at night, you'd have cleaned out the fire, banked a fire for the morning, you would let the pressure drop down, but you'd still have steam pressure in them because you don't want to cool the locomotive off and then heat it back up and cause all that expansion and contraction stuff, right? So if you've got a leaky throttle and you don't chock the wheels and the throttle leaks enough steam, you could just have a locomotive taking a little trip towards the front wall and maybe stopping at the front wall and maybe not stopping at the front wall. So if you look on the outside of this wall, you will see several stalls that have been rebuilt because the locomotive did not stop. So, so we'll see. From the marketing point of view, you know, haunted locomotive, like how much better could you get, right? So over here in stall 1 is the real Smithsonian grade piece of equipment that we have. This is the M1 gas electric from 1927. So in the 20s, more and more people have cars. Passenger traffic has dropped off, but the railroad still wants to keep that mail contract. So they go to the J.G. Brill Company, the streetcar manufacturer in Philadelphia, and Brill's companions, the Westinghouse Corporation, and asked for a narrow gauge version of what Brill and Westinghouse had been selling to standard gauge railroads. So This unit has a 12-seat passenger compartment, freight compartment here for the mail and whatever else, and engine compartment up front. This was actually built here because Brill did not have narrow gauge erecting facilities. So instead they sent a stack of drawings like so and a kit of parts, including like traction engines and controllers and the engine. So the engine's kind of entertaining. In World War I, Brill tried to get a War Department contract to build dirigible motors. So you remember the dirigible, you know, fixed frame airship kind of thing. Brill did not get the contract. What a streetcar manufacturer was doing trying to get a dirigible, I don't know. They didn't get the contract, but they did build a pretty good motor because that's what's in here and it's still running. We had this out 2 weeks ago. So this is an inline 6-cylinder, 250 horsepower aluminum block aircraft engine that is turning a generator that's right about here and powering 75 horsepower motors on all 4 axles. This is a one of a kind. It's the only gas electric built for an American narrow gauge. Brill did build some gas mechanicals, one of which survives out in Bishop or Laws, California. I can't remember which narrow gauge, but this is the super cool toy that we have here. It has a brand new roof on it, thanks to the Emory Rail Heritage Trust, and we had enough money left over from that grant that we're going to be able to paint it too. Apparently the red window frames are going away, so if you modeled this car with the red roof and the red windows, we got bad news for you. You're going to have to repaint. Any other questions?
Did this just run on its own, or did it cool a car behind it?
That's an excellent question. Coach 8, which we will see down in the machine shops, was rebuilt with roller bearing trucks so that it could serve as a trailer for this. I'm not sure that that happened too often. This could also move up to 3 loaded hopper cars around. And in the early tourist years, they discovered that it could drag a dead steam locomotive back from the picnic grove if it had to, because that was all they had then. Now we've got little diesels for dragging dead steam locomotives around, but yeah.
So why was 16 chosen? That one of those need least work, or?
Yeah, 16 was chosen because in 55 it had been in the shop most of the year and had gotten a fair amount of work done. And when we looked over everything, the running gear was in not terrible shape. The boiler looked pretty solid. We've had a couple little surprises, but nothing that you wouldn't expect for a locomotive that nobody's been inside of since, 1956. So, you know what, they're cutting boiler jacket material for it, so that seems to me like a good sign. Brad Esposito, our general manager, says when one of the cabs that is currently sitting outside disappears, that'll be your sign that we're getting close. All right, we'll head out this way. How are you? I did do a check on that. About all we know about it is that during the Civil War, an officer who died during the war had his funeral here. The master mechanic is determined that this will once again be the master mechanic office. This room with a bay window here. My own vote would be he shouldn't be allowed to use it for his office until we can make sure that the second floor does not come down on him. Some structural work, you know, is in order. This building is part storage and has just been stabilized with a lot of work from the Friends of the East Broadtop volunteers emptying out 722 bins of metal parts, plus a whole bunch of junk that was just strewn all over the floor here. And upstairs, in addition to parts that are useful for a locomotive or whatever, there's also a lot of large plumbing fixtures for the water systems in the two company towns. Where better to put them than on the floor of the second story of a parts building, right? So Friends volunteers estimate that they moved about 25 tons of metal out of this building. It had sunk on both ends till into about here, but where it had stayed dry in the middle, that whole bin structure had bent like this. So we had professional contractors come down. The Friends of East Broadtop paid for the project, and they're now putting new siding on, building new windows, and we're going to put all the parts back in the 722 bins, but this time they'll be cataloged, so we'll know what's where. So we've been very fortunate that Dave Dimitrovich, the master mechanic, is finding completely usable parts around here. So it's pretty terrific that stock that the railroad bought in the 1930s, 1940s is still here and is going into use. Sand tower for putting sand in the locomotive sand domes, water column. Railroad had a reservoir down at the far end of the yard. Water was pumped uphill to two holding ponds on the hillside, fed by gravity through a network of mostly wooden water pipes. They are pretty much trashed by now, so we're going to replace them with a new water system. But turns out Hurricane Ida dropped 7.5 inches of rain here. The reservoir filled up despite the dams having been breached, and water found its way through the remains of that wooden water pipe network and starts gushing up in the machine shop. So that was a little bit of a surprise. Just watch your stuff coming over the tracks here. This is the railroad's blacksmith shop. There's a giant steam hammer in the middle of that, plus a lot of new window sash being built by FEBT members. Somebody estimated a couple of months ago that the Friends have been volunteering here since 2001, and we're still only 49% of the way through window replacement. So there's a lot of windows. Behind me is the foundry. The railroad could cast its own parts in iron and in brass. This is a scrap pile so that you could melt down scrap to make new parts out of. There's a compressed air powered hoist under this little gantry thing. You could feed into that furnace that's at the base of that stack from the top. Railroad has a fairly complete collection of wooden patterns for parts. You take the wooden pattern, build a sand mold around it, pour your molten metal into the mold, and then you got your part. This is fire suppression pipe here. We've got the roundhouse hooked up and the main shop's hooked up, but we don't yet have a pump. We discovered that if there were a fire and we connected to the municipal water system and had high-powered pumps, we basically sucked the municipal water system dry and stuff would start to implode. So we're back at the drawing board on that one. Yeah, just crowd in. So this is the thing that other tourist railroads really don't have, which is an intact circa 1910 machine shop complex. This is all original, and you know, there have been a few additions and deletions over the years, but this is a pretty serious machine shop complex. We have done enough stabilization work that we are now able to get things operating. The middle line shaft works. You can see the stationary steam engine over here. We don't actually know how old this is. It came here secondhand at some point. Could be Civil War era. Stationary steam engine powers that flywheel and the belt. Belt goes up to the middle line shaft through the building. We just got a belt back in this trough up here to power the front line shaft. There's another line shaft in the back, the boiler section of the building. Line shaft goes into the car shop, which is where woodworking equipment was, goes underground under that line of metal plates into the corner of the blacksmith shop, went through under this little roof between here and the foundry and powered a tumbler and I think a sharpener over there. The way this works is when you start that steam engine, every belt in the place is turning. And for each machine, there's an idler wheel, and as long as the belt is on the idler wheel, nothing's happening. When you're ready to use a machine, you've got a lever to pull the belt over onto the drive wheel, and then you're in business for whatever machine that is. We're able now to run the steam engine off of compressed air. We've been given a compact 100 horsepower propane fired steam boiler that we hope to get hooked up, and our goal is that every tour that comes through here we'd be able to demonstrate stuff, not just by having the tour guide turn stuff. So you'll just have to suffer through with me today. This is a hydraulic wheel press. Railroad wheels are held onto their axles by what the engineers call an interference fit, which just means that the hole in the wheel is the same size as the axle, and you're going to push and push and push till the wheel goes on. You can also pop wheels off after you have run ruts into them. At least on this railroad, freight car wheels were thought of as disposable. So instead of trying to reprofile that freight car wheel, it would go out on the meltdown pile and you would buy new ones and pop them on. But they would reuse the axles. So there's a kind of nifty sequence here, because the next thing over after the wheel press is the axle lathe. And if you want, you can come around and just get a little bit more of an idea of what's going on here. They've got a crane here that they could use to swing the axle over, and the axle lathe mounts in the center here, and you can have cutting heads on either end. What you want to do, if you're going to reuse the axle, you remachine this spot right here, which is where the wheel is going to go. Get that all nice and shiny smooth. Remachine right here, which is where the weight of the car is going to be held up. And get that all good to go. Check this out, it even turns. With some volunteers put this back for me this axle had been down on the floor, so I can now give you a demonstration. So 3 cheers for them. When you're done machining the axle, you take a set of calipers, measure exactly how big you need the hole in the wheel to be, and then you go right down here to the wheel boring machine. You've got a chain hoist on the far side to pop the wheel up onto the bed of the machine, and then you can bore it out to exactly the dimensions you need to put it back on the axle. Take it back outside, slide it over. There was a little trolley system that ran through that alleyway, and freight cars were mostly rebuilt back at the far end of the car shop, which is this next building over. Unfortunately, that's not in good enough shape to take you through. When people get swallowed up by the floor there, it's ugly. Yeah, sir.
So every time you redo an axle, it gets smaller and smaller. Every time you rebore a wheel, it gets bigger and bigger.
Right, so you can't do that forever.
Well, you can't do it twice in the same one. I mean, you're going
Right.
So do they somehow keep track of the number of times each one has been?
I think at some point somebody says, you know, what, that one's done. You know, these people would be basically constantly changing out freight car wheels in here in later years. So you figure you've got 240, 50 hopper cars, and they are making multiple trips a week. Rock is being dumped into them, they're dumping rock out. It's not too long before you need to do some work. So, but it's a good question.
Well, you can't put the same wheel back on the same axle.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But they were disposing of the wheels,
Okay.
not locomotive wheels. They would remachine or reprofile those, but freight car wheels, they just figured it was a time saver to put a new one on, and they weren't that expensive. So a lot of what we're looking at here is 1905 to 1907. Same era that Siebert is rebuilding bridges and putting down heavier rail. He gets permission from the board to make the railroad as close to self-sufficient as he can. So there was a pretty big shopping spree for equipment. The one thing that we think didn't come till a little bit later, the great big planer in the front there is 1910 or 1911, and was so big that it wouldn't fit into the north-south alignment of the belt drive system. Didn't even fit in the building, so they had to pop the front wall out, and they had to build a mule drive so the belt system makes a left turn over the back end of that machine, goes up to its own little line shaft, and then pops back down onto this machine. So this is a pretty cool set of toys here. If you want to come down this way a sec. There's one more pit to not fall in here. So this is locomotive number 14, which seems likely to be the second one out. This is from 1912. As you can see, it's got all of the appliances off, the boiler jacket off, the asbestos lagging off, front end open up, it's off of its drivers. This locomotive seems to be in pretty good shape, but the drivers had enough cracks in them, had been welded repeatedly, that we just determined that it made sense to go have new driver centers cast. So that's going on. You can see where this is all gridded off with chalk squares here, and the center of each of those, they did an ultrasound test to measure the thickness of the metal, so you know what sort of shape the boiler is in. Also, this locomotive is off of its drivers because they've been sent out to be recast. This is a crane-free railroad, so there's no lifting a locomotive up off its drivers. What we have instead is a drop pit with a pit jack back here. You would run the locomotive in, position the first set of drivers over this pit, support the axle from underneath with the jack, remove two little sections of rail on either side, and drop the set of drivers down into the pit. And because that jack is on rails, you can run it over into the middle pretty easily and lift it up. The coach over there is the coach that was rebuilt with roller bearing trucks to be pulled by the M1. It is basically run in just about every tourist era train since 1960. It's a second-hand car. It came here in the teens from the Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn. We think it dates to about 1890. Wood frame car. Lynn Moedinger, formerly of the Strasburg Railroad, has taken it upon himself to get the sag out of the middle. The way you do that, apparently on a wood frame car, you want to have a slight arch in the car called a camber, and then you hold the two ends together with metal truss rods that are underneath. Unfortunately, on that car, the beam that the truss rods come into on the south end was basically Swiss cheese. So Moedinger and some volunteers spent, they would come for 3 and 4 days at a time for multiple months rebuilding this whole end beam, got it all back in, got everything coopered up, dropped the car back down onto its trucks, tightened up the truss rods, and the new beam snapped. He was not a happy camper that day. But
I bet.
we have now gone and gotten another new piece of wood to try that all over again, because we really do need that car. It's the only full-on coach that we have. And, okay, so I'm now 17 minutes over my limit for talking to you guys. I have not made 1 hour yet on the tour. So we're done, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Do you get involved with the tires on the steam engines, on the dry wheels?
We have stacks of tires out back. It has been a while since I've seen them do the whole gas ring around the wheel thing. Whether we will end up doing that here or have that done at Strasburg, I'm not sure. We're still sort of feeling our way around multiple questions, one of which is, what does it make sense to try and do in this shop? Right. So we've got amazing equipment here, but no heat, lousy light, terrible floors, miserable working conditions part of the year, and this is National Historic Landmark. You don't want to burn it down, right? No, so in an ideal world, we would have a modern repair facility somewhere where it wouldn't be in the line of sight, and we would compete for contract business. But we're not at that ideal world yet. So
I have one question for you.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned there were 2 standard gauge steam locomotives in the collection when it was purchased for scrap.
Yes.
Are those on the property or
the older and more hated of the 2 was sold to the Whitewater Valley in Indiana back in '75, I think. And it has a lap seam boiler that is, I don't know whether it's actually illegal or just very difficult to get certified. There doesn't seem to be a lot of that's in their deadline. The second locomotive, which is the newest steam locomotive at the EBT from 1923, and also the heaviest, even though it's not especially big as a standard gauge switcher, that is still in, as far as we know, still in the engine house in Mount Union. but the northern 4 miles of the railroad had been sold to another party some years back, and apparently that locomotive had also been sold, and it was just up for sale on Ozark Mountain Rail Equipment. And it's now no longer up for sale, but we don't know what's happened to it.
Gotcha.
So anybody who has any insight on who bought that, we'd be happy to know.
I don't have that insight, but if I did, I would share it with you.
Thank you. We're debating whether, somebody's gonna have to go lie on the tracks in front of the engine house to prevent that locomotive from
Yeah.
leaving Mount Union. But that's where that is.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
Well, it does explain where the second cab came from.